At 4:32 a.m. on September 26, 2025, residents in Moscow were startled awake by the sound of air raid sirens, a sound that, for decades, Russians never expected to hear in their own capital. Within minutes, flashes lit up the night sky as air defense systems opened fire on what the Kremlin described as a massive wave of Ukrainian drones. According to Russian officials, more than 20 drones were launched at Moscow and the surrounding region, with several intercepted over the Belgorod border area. In Moscow itself, the roar of anti-aircraft guns and the bright trails of interceptor missiles painted a scene more reminiscent of Kyiv than the Russian capital. Videos quickly flooded social media, showing fireballs exploding mid-air and debris crashing down on residential areas. While Russian authorities claimed that all drones were successfully neutralized, fragments reportedly damaged at least 3 apartment buildings in western Moscow, injuring 4 civilians. For Ukraine, this was not just another drone strike, it was a symbolic move deep inside Russian territory. The attack showed once again that the war is no longer confined to Ukrainian soil. It is spreading, reaching into the very heart of Russia, and challenging the Kremlin's long-standing narrative that ordinary Russians can live untouched by the war their government wages. The Belgorod region, located near Ukraine's northeastern border, has become a frequent target of Ukrainian drone operations. On the same night, explosions were reported near military facilities outside Belgorod city. Russian state media confirmed attempted strikes, but insisted they caused no major damage. However, independent monitoring groups posted satellite images suggesting that an ammunition depot may have been hit. This escalation is part of a broader Ukrainian strategy. Facing relentless Russian drone and missile strikes on cities like Kharkiv, Kyiv, and Odessa, Ukraine has increasingly responded by striking inside Russia. These cross-border drone attacks serve both tactical and psychological purposes. They disrupt Russian logistics, force the Kremlin to allocate more resources to homeland defense, and shatter the illusion of safety for Russian citizens. For President Volodymyr Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership, the message is clear. If Russia brings war to our homes, we will bring war to yours. And nowhere embodies this message more powerfully than Moscow itself. The Kremlin, however, paints a different picture. Russian defense officials declared the operation a successful neutralization of terrorist drones, crediting the effectiveness of Moscow's Pantsir S-1 air defense systems. They emphasized that no critical infrastructure was damaged, and that life in the capital continued as normal. Yet, beneath the official statements, signs of anxiety are visible. Flights at Moscow's Vnukovo and Sheremetyevo airports were temporarily suspended, and residents expressed anger online about the lack of transparency from authorities. One Muscovite told independent reporters, "We keep hearing that everything is under control, but when debris falls on your street at 5 a.m., you know the war is not far away anymore." The timing of the drone attack is important. Just days before, Russia had escalated strikes against Kharkiv and other Ukrainian cities, killing civilians and targeting power plants. Many analysts view Ukraine's Moscow operation as direct retaliation. In fact, Ukrainian sources hinted that the drones were aimed at symbolic targets in the Russian capital, not just military facilities, but also to demonstrate reach and resilience. Technically, these attacks are made possible by Ukraine's growing arsenal of long-range drones, many developed domestically. Unlike the Iranian-made Shaheds used by Russia, Ukrainian drones are often improvised, modified, and upgraded in secret facilities. Over the past year, Kyiv has received Western assistance in developing more advanced UAVs, some with ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers. These innovations mean that no part of Russia is truly out of reach anymore. The attacks on Moscow and Belgorod also highlight the shifting dynamics of the war in 2025. While Russia continues to hold significant territory in eastern and southern Ukraine, Ukraine has turned to asymmetric warfare using drones, sabotage, and special operations to offset Russia's numerical superiority. For the Kremlin, this is a nightmare scenario, a drawn-out war that not only bleeds its military, but also unsettles its own population. Internationally, the Moscow drone incident drew mixed reactions. Western allies largely remained silent on whether they directly supported such operations, but officials in Washington reiterated that Ukraine has the right to defend itself by any means necessary. Meanwhile, European leaders emphasized that the responsibility lies with Moscow for starting the war. However, there were also quiet concerns that strikes deep inside Russia risk escalating the conflict further, potentially triggering unpredictable responses from the Kremlin. Inside Ukraine, the reaction was one of grim satisfaction. Social media buzzed with videos of explosions over Moscow, many accompanied by captions like, "Now they know how Kharkiv feels." For a nation battered by years of war, the ability to strike the Russian capital is seen as both justice and deterrence. Yet, Ukrainian officials remain careful, neither confirming nor denying their direct role in the attack. This ambiguity gives Kyiv room to maneuver diplomatically, while still sending its message to Moscow loud and clear. The Belgorod strikes, though less symbolic than those on Moscow, are equally significant. Belgorod has been a critical hub for Russian military operations, serving as a launchpad for attacks on Kharkiv and eastern Ukraine. Repeated Ukrainian strikes in the area disrupt supply lines, damage stockpiles, and tie down Russian air defenses. Analysts argue that Ukraine is deliberately stretching Russian defenses thin, forcing them to guard cities like Moscow, while also protecting frontline logistics. But with every strike inside Russia comes the question, how will Putin respond? Historically, the Kremlin has used such incidents to justify further escalation. Already, Russian state TV has called for punishment strikes against Kyiv, and even hinted at expanding the scope of war efforts. Some hardliners demand the use of decisive weapons, a veiled reference to tactical nuclear options, though most experts consider such threats rhetorical. What is undeniable is that the war is entering a new, more dangerous phase. By striking Moscow and Belgorod, Ukraine has demonstrated that the conflict is no longer one-sided in terms of reach. The homeland of Russia itself is becoming a battlefield, even if the Kremlin refuses to admit it publicly. The psychological impact on ordinary Russians cannot be overstated. For many, this was the first time they truly felt vulnerable. Polls inside Russia are notoriously unreliable, but anecdotal reports suggest growing unease in major cities. If the war continues to reach Moscow with increasing frequency, public pressure on the Kremlin could rise, even if dissent remains tightly controlled. In the broader context of global security, these strikes raise alarm. If Ukraine can repeatedly hit Moscow, the conflict risks spiraling into scenarios that draw in NATO more directly, especially if Russian retaliation spills across borders. Already, Poland and the Baltic states have stepped up air patrols, fearing the war could cross into NATO territory. The night of September 26th marked not just another skirmish in this war, but a turning point in perception. Moscow, a city once thought untouchable, was under fire. Belgorod, a frontline staging ground, once again felt the sting of Ukrainian drones. And Ukraine, though battered, showed that it retains the will and capability to strike back. By dawn, Moscow's skyline returned to its deceptive calm. Streets bustled with traffic, shops opened, and life went on, but the fear lingered. The war, which once seemed far away, had arrived at Russia's doorstep. For the Kremlin, the challenge is no longer just defeating Ukraine. It is convincing its own citizens that they are safe, even when the evidence says otherwise. This was the story of Ukraine's drone attacks on Moscow and Belgorod, September 26, 2025, a night that reminded the world that the Russia-Ukraine war is far from contained and that its consequences reach far beyond the front lines. So stay safe, stay updated. We'll see you in next video.